you found the clap hands thing there, so that's great. And I see cousin Kevin is here, so thanks for coming, Kevin. I'm going to switch to a presentation, which gives the advantage of you don't really have to look at me, which my students always appreciate, and I'm sure you will too. This is a talk that I've given a few times, although I've expanded and updated it in just the past couple of weeks to address some of the situations that are going on today. What we mean by fake news has changed quite a bit over the last few years, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I'll tell you, I'll give you an indication of how much it's changed. A couple of years ago, I was putting together a talk for my students on fake news, and I started searching my files, and I saw that I had talked about fake news in 2014. And I said, well, what was this all about? I don't remember that this was even on the horizon in 2014. And so I opened up the file, and I was talking about Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, which is an entirely different kind of fake news from what we are dealing with now. So what I'm going to be talking about is what it is, what it isn't, and how to avoid it. And that will be the first part of my talk, and then we're going to get into some of the really unfortunate situations that we're dealing with at the moment, especially around COVID-19. So I thought I'd begin with a brief history of fake news. I should have gotten a better illustration than this because we all know that this was not fake news, this was real. If you may remember that at one time you couldn't go through the checkout line at a supermarket without seeing the Weekly World News with stories about Bat Child. And I suppose that doesn't really qualify as the kind of fake news that we're talking about, because I don't think anybody was really expected to believe it. It was just entertainment. Now, here's something that very much was not entertainment. This is a engraving by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre. And the reason I'm including this in fake news is that this never happened. I actually did my master's thesis 100 years ago on, and it was good to do it 100 years ago because I was able to talk to some of the survivors. Although even then they would have been gone, wouldn't they? I did my master's thesis on how the Boston Massacre was covered by the press in Boston of its day. And what I discovered was that in the years leading up to the Boston Massacre, all of the loyalist pro-British publishers had been driven out of town, sent back to England. A few of them were tarred and feathered by Samuel Adams and his gang of rowdies. And so then the Boston Massacre takes place, and all of the publishers were allied with the Patriot cause, and they fell in line and promoted this propagandistic view of what the Boston Massacre was all about. So here you see here this well-ordered line of British soldiers just gunning down these poor colonials who were doing nothing wrong. And that was the image that we had of that. By the way, let me call your attention to my favorite part of this, the little dog in front. No one knows what on earth that's doing there. The speculation is that Revere had somehow made a mistake. He botched the plate, and so that there was this mark in it that just looked awful. And so he added a dog to cover it up. So what really happened? Some of you may know from your history more or less what the real story was. And the real story was that the British soldiers were so badly paid that some of them had part-time jobs in the city. They worked on, I think that some of them worked at a rope making uh, operation. So one night, some of them were walking home, walking back to their ship, and they came across a group of Samuel Adams's rowdies who had had a few too many to drink, and an argument breaks out. And one of the British soldiers, really in fear more than anything, shot his weapon. And a few more shots were fired, and of course, a few people were killed. Um, and we all know the story of John Adams defending the British soldiers in court and actually winning their acquittal. So this was a very early example of fake news. And despite the fact that the soldiers were acquitted, you might say that the die was cast. This image of the British soldiers gunning down the colonials was cemented in history and in memory. And it was one of the, as we know, one of the incidents that led to the American Revolution. Now, here's another example of fake news. We tend to think today that journalism has been completely upended by technology, and it has, but it's not the first time. Around the year 1830, we finally began to see newspapers printed on mechanized steam presses. Everything had been done by hand up until then. So newspapers were scarce and expensive. Starting in 1830, they became plentiful and cheap. This was the rise of what's often called the penny press. And the very first example of the penny press was the New York Sun, published by somebody named Benjamin Day. And again, the expensive hand-printed newspapers tended to be about politics and public affairs, done in a very propagandistic way, but nevertheless dealing with serious issues, because the papers were essentially sponsored by political parties. With the rise of the penny press, newspaper publishers began to pursue a mass audience. And this was an example of that. Benjamin Day thought, well, what would my large working class audience like to read about? And how can I expand that audience? And he thought, well, of course, people would love to know what's taking place on the moon, right? And so they ran this series of articles, supposedly images of life on the moon taken through a telescope, and created this absolute sensation in the New York Sun with these stories. Now, I have to say, a book was written about this a few years ago. I should probably read it. I don't know whether people really believed it or not, or just took it as entertainment. But certainly, this was another early example of fake news. Now, the next one I want to show you is more like the Paul Revere engraving, in that the purpose of it was political propaganda. And that is the famous front page of the New York Journal, printed by William Randolph Hearst, after the explosion of the USS Maine in Cuba, I should say in the harbor in Cuba. We now know that the Maine blew up as the result of an accident. There was a malfunction in the boiler room. But Hearst and other yellow publishers of the day, including Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World, competed to whipped the nation, well, I should say whipped New York into a war frenzy to go to war against Spain for blowing up the Maine. And here you see this front page, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. And over and over and over, it says $50,000 reward. And you look at $50,000 and it reminds me of Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers movie, saying that he would destroy the world if he was not given $1 million. There was, today, the $50,000 looks kind of absurd. Now you look at the picture they put together and you can see wires going to the shore. If you could see it a little more clearly, you'd see a detonation device over on the left-hand side. And this was all speculative, and it turned out that it wasn't true. But it did, in fact, lead the country into war. There's a famous story that Hearst sent a illustrator to Cuba ahead of the war. And the illustrator was getting bored. There was nothing going on. And he cabled Hearst and said, "What should I do?" And Hearst famously replied, "This may be apocryphal, but if it isn't true, it should be." Hearst allegedly replied, "You supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." And indeed, we went to war with Spain. And it was a completely unjust war. And it had consequences for the US and for Spain and its holdings for many, many decades. Now, let me bring us up to just before the internet era. I was working at the Boston Phoenix when Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992. And anyone who was working in the media at that time can recall that we were constantly receiving tips from conspiracy theorists who believed that Clinton had been involved in some sort of a scheme at an airstrip called Mena in western Arkansas that involved drug dealing, the CIA, all this crazy stuff. And there was nothing to it, of course. And it eventually faded away. But I think it's an interesting sign that even before the internet, it was very much possible to get stuff like this to go viral, and so that was an example. Okay, so now we get into the modern definition of fake news, and I'm going to throw a little bit of a curve at you because I think that a lot of what we thought we knew in the fall of 2016 turned out to be misunderstood. But I'm going to begin by telling you the story that we all thought we knew in 2016, and then we'll kind of revise it and move on. I first learned about this new type of fake news from BuzzFeed and the New York Times, which were reporting on a flood of misinformation online that was designed not to persuade anybody to vote a certain way, but to make money. Here's how it works. You get something, you set up a cheap website, you write fake news stories, you post them on Facebook and Twitter, you do it in such a way that you try to get this stuff to go viral so that many, many people take an interest in it. They click through to your website, they see the Google ads that you have on the website, and they make a little bit of money. They don't make a great deal of money, but they make it up on volume. And I suppose that if you get enough of these things, you can actually make some decent money. Now, you probably all remember the story, the fake news story, that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. You remember that? Well, in fact, before that, a lot of these content farms put out a story that the Pope had endorsed Hillary Clinton. And they weren't getting the kind of engagement they wanted. They weren't getting the clicks. Not enough people were coming through to their websites and earning them a little bit of money from Google Ads. So somebody said, well, let's try the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. And they did. And that became a phenomenon. And many people clicked through. And so they started making some money. Now, where were these people based? Believe it or not, a lot of these were teenagers in Macedonia, young people in Macedonia. And this is an actual image of a village in Macedonia. And if you look through the windows, you might see a glowing computer with a teenager sitting in front of it. Maybe not. We'd have to blow it up a little bigger, wouldn't we? You'd say, how did this happen? Well, the reason it happened is, you remember I told you that the money from Google Ads was pretty minimal. They really weren't making much of any money at all. But it was enough for the kids in Macedonia for it to be worthwhile. And it started spreading among their friends, and pretty soon a lot of them were doing it. What were some fake news sites? Okay, here is where I have to say we're starting to get some overlap between fake news for profit and fake news for propaganda. So for instance, I've listed Alex Jones's horrible site, InfoWars, on here as a fake news site. And the reason I decided he fit into this category is that even though he is promulgating fake stories for the purpose of political propaganda, he's also doing it for money. He has a line of personal care products of some sort, and he uses his site to get it out there. Another one, and a lot of these sites come and go, so CBS News is not there anymore, but you can see what they did. And this was aimed at profit. CBSnews.com is the actual website of CBS News, which is, you know, certainly a reliable source of news. So somebody added a .co to the end and made a fake news site out of it whose address kind of looked like the official CBS News site. And like I said, that's gone now, but nevertheless, it was a big deal for a while. So, what can we do about fake news? Well, if you're talking about fake news in its purest form, and that is designed for profit rather than political propaganda, one thing that you can do, and Google and Facebook have tried to do this, is deny them any ad revenue. Don't let them participate in your advertising programs. And if the only thing they're really interested in is money, that will help cut down on the problem. But they've had limited success. And of course, the web itself is completely open. And I'll give you another example of what the challenge is. Again, going back to Alex Jones. He has been essentially deplatformed. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Apple, they've all thrown him off their platforms. But his website, which is, you know, a real free, the web is a real free speech bastion, and there really isn't much you can do about what people do on the web. Alex Jones's InfoWars website is still a big hit, reaching millions and millions of people. It doesn't reach as many as it did when he had Facebook and everybody to amplify his message, but it still reaches a lot of people. Now, next I would like to talk about what I call false news. And as I said, there's actually much more of an overlap between fake news and false news than we used to understand. So let me try to explain what I mean here. Now, there's President Trump standing in front of the Swedish flag. And I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago, he started tweeting about some horrible crimes that have been carried out by immigrants in Sweden. And people said, what is he talking about? Did he just make this up? Well, it turned out that he had seen something on the internet, or maybe somebody had even talked about it on Fox News, and he repeated it, but it wasn't true. So to me, false news is error-riddled or deceptive stories that have a political agenda. The aim is not necessarily to make money. There's our old friend Stephen Bannon, who turned Breitbart into a major false news operation during the 2016 presidential campaign. Some examples would indeed be Breitbart. Much of Fox News, certainly the three primetime talk shows that are on from 8 to 11 p.m. A couple of weeks ago for my WGBH column, I sat and watched the entire Fox primetime lineup. And it was just filled with misinformation about COVID-19. And all of it was aimed at improving President Trump's political fortunes. So that's what I call false news. And we see some of this on the left too. And I've always considered Occupy Democrats to be an example of that. Not necessarily completely false, but wildly exaggerated and designed to get you angry. So that's false news. Now, unlike fake news, where you can at least consider denying them their ad money, false news, I think, generally really falls into the category of speech that's protected by the First Amendment. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes put it, the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. And this often gets collapsed into the phrase, the marketplace of ideas. Another way to look at it is the best solution to bad speech is more speech. And I'm pretty much a First Amendment absolutist, and I think that that's really the only step that we can take with this stuff. Now, I told you that there was an overlap. There was a real problem that we didn't quite appreciate during the 2016 campaign at the time. It wasn't all teenagers in Macedonia trying to see how they could exploit Pope Francis to make a few bucks from Google ads. There was also a massive Russian propaganda effort. Whether you think that the Trump campaign was directly involved in it or not, there's no question that this effort existed and that the Russians were acting on behalf of the Trump campaign, even if they weren't directly involved with them. So for instance, Russian agents reached millions and millions of people on Facebook. They managed to get 131,000 messages on Twitter. And you'd say, well, is this really effective? Does it really make a difference? Well, let me give you an example of where it may very well have made a difference. You don't necessarily change people's minds with this stuff, but what you can do is discourage them so that they don't vote. You might recall that in 2016, African-American voters did not turn out for Hillary Clinton the way that had been predicted. And lack of enthusiasm among Black voters was one of the reasons that she lost. Well, the Russian social media campaign included tons of material about the Clintons' support for a tough on crime law in the mid-90s that was popular at the time, but later became very unpopular. It was responsible for a lot of the mass incarceration problem with African Americans, and it's become something that when you talk to African American voters, you want to, as a candidate, you want to say, we're going to do something about that and fix it. So by flooding the zone with this propaganda, and not untrue propaganda, in this case it was truthful, about Hillary Clinton's husband's support for this tough on crime law, it may have helped depress African American turnout, and that might have been one of the factors in why Donald Trump won the election. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is show you my all-time favorite piece of Russian social media propaganda, just because it is so cool. I don't know if you remember this or not. This was just like complete insanity, right? I don't know who this persuades, but maybe if you are an evangelical voter, maybe if you see enough of this, maybe if it pops up in your news feed over and over and over, it has some subliminal effect in getting you to vote against Hillary Clinton. Anyway. Now that brings me finally to what is real news. And real news, I don't have to go into this much. We know what real news is. There's a wonderful book that was written a number of years ago by two veteran journalists named Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel, called The Elements of Journalism. And they boil it down very well. They say that journalism's first obligation is to the truth, and that it's based on the discipline of verification. It doesn't mean that we always get it right. It means that we're trying to get it right, and that we're really not serving any master except the public interest. And when we screw it up, we correct ourselves. The goal is to meet the information needs of a democratic society. And the examples I would give you are most traditional news organizations. So what can we do about real news? Well, I think we should need to support news organizations that we trust with subscriptions, or in the case of public media, donations. Local news is in the midst of an existential crisis made much worse by COVID-19. Advertising, which has been on the wane for many years, disappeared almost overnight when the pandemic hit. And pretty much the only source of revenue that news organizations are getting these days are the money that is sent to them by their readers, viewers, listeners, and the like. Now, here's some advice for not being that person who shares a fake news story on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. If you see something that just looks crazy, and it might be crazy, but it might appeal to your specific biases or ideology, because that's how Facebook works, right? The algorithm is designed to throw stuff at you that keeps you riled up and keeps you on Facebook. So if you see something and it just seems like it's too good to be true, ask yourself if there seems to be something fishy about it. See if you can find anything about it at Snopes.com or another fact-checking site. Check the source. Is it a respected news organization, or is it a site you've never heard of? And then finally, Google some keywords to see if other news organizations are reporting the same story. Now, unfortunately, we are living in a time of hyperpolarization. And among some people, and I have to say, they are essentially people on the right, although I see it on the left too. If no one else is reporting the story, it just means that they're part of the conspiracy. And believe me, news organizations are not part of a conspiracy. If they haven't reported something that is explosive, it's either because it isn't true or they're still trying to verify it. Here's just a few news organizations that I think are worthy of your support. Somebody was asking me today, because I gave this talk a couple of nights ago, well, what about Time Magazine? I said, yeah, absolutely. Time has a new billionaire owner who's trying to build it back up again. So this is not an exclusive list, but it's a list of good, respectable, real news organizations that I think that you can't go wrong with. And because I think it's important to keep in mind that some people really can't pay for news, and especially now, it's also important to keep in mind that there are a number of news outlets that their business model, they look for memberships, they look for donations, but you don't have to pay. And here are some examples of those. And of course, the one I work for part-time, WGBH, is right up there. Now, I want to take a complete swerve into what we're dealing with today. As we know, in the fall of 2016, when we were trying to make sense of the term fake news, it ended up getting hijacked by President Trump and his supporters, who essentially said that anything that they didn't like was fake news. The president has essentially instructed his followers that he is the one source of truthful information. Media distrust is misunderstood. We often say, oh, people don't trust the media. Not really true. Well, it's true in a broad sense, but we trust the media that we use. And there's so much media today, all of it catering to our particular partisan leanings, that we seek out media that tends to appeal to us, and we denigrate everything else. And as a result, many Trump supporters disregard mainstream reporting as fake news. So I mentioned that. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'm going to kind of move through this rather quickly. This is a survey from the Pew Research Center. And you can see that Democrats and people who lean Democratic are looking at a range of different news organizations, but Republicans and people who lean Republican are overwhelmingly tapped into fake news, into Fox News. So there's a phrase that I love called epistemic closure. And what it means is that you are so wrapped up in your belief system that might be fed by President Trump and Fox News and Breitbart, that no contrary information can really penetrate that bubble. Now, I don't mean to say that we don't see this on the left as well, but there have been studies. There was a very good study done a few years ago by MIT and Harvard that showed that liberal-leaning voters do tend to avail themselves of a much wider set of media organizations, whereas people on the right were very tightly clustered around Fox News and Breitbart. So you see, here's a situation where President Trump, who actually began his political career by questioning whether President Obama was born in the US, essentially Obama at one point finally produced his birth certificate. And how much difference did that make? It made no difference whatsoever. Obviously, the birth certificate was faked, right? So this is the kind of problem that we're dealing with in terms of trying to build a journalism that reaches more than just the people who already don't like President Trump. Here's something that comes from one of the far reaches of the right-wing fever swamps. You may know that they believe that these mass shootings, including Sandy Hook, were the work of crisis actors. And this one claims that the same crisis actor showed up at three different mass shootings. In the case of Boston, it was the marathon bombing. Awaken the mind. Is this the same girl at all three massacres? The short answer, no, it's not. Now, this brings us up to COVID-19. And we know that there are a lot of conspiracy theories floating around about the pandemic, and that President Trump has actually embraced some of those conspiracy theories. Here's something that a friend of mine who is a nurse posted on Facebook the other day. And it was a story that was saying that hospitals are getting paid to label the cause of death as coronavirus, even if it was something else, with the idea being that the number of deaths attributed to COVID-19 are really not nearly as high as they're being made out to be, because there are these payoffs going on to inflate the number, which I guess is aimed at making President Trump look bad or something. Now, this was posted on Facebook. Facebook has been inadequate in responding to this kind of thing. And you might see that there's this little I here. Well, the I is information about the source. And if anybody bothered to click on it, and the problem is it's not very prominent, I don't think very many people do click on it, they would have seen that it's a site that has shared false news, that the head of it is a conspiracy theorist, and that, you know, essentially this was not to be taken seriously. I imagine that there are people who did click on the I and just said, oh, well, Facebook is part of the conspiracy. I believe it anyway. Lately, we've seen the famous embrace of injecting or drinking bleach. I forget what it was, but I think that your doctor would recommend that you not do either. And again, you see certain people believing this because the president puts it out and it fits their worldview. And it's very difficult to know what to do about that. So, you know, what we worry about in journalism is, can we restore trust in what we do? And I think that we are living through rather dark times, and it's a difficult problem with not any obvious solutions. As I said, I kind of rushed the end of it a little bit because I want to make sure that we have time to talk to you. So I'm going to stop sharing, and